There is a document kept inside a secure office at Buckingham Palace that most people never think about. It is called the Councillor of State Register. It lists the names of individuals authorised to act on behalf of the monarch when the king is incapacitated or abroad. Harry's name is on that register. It has been there for 6 years. 6 years of public attacks against his own family, a memoir that named his brother as a physical aggressor, a Netflix documentary that questioned Catherine's motives. And through all of it, through every headline and every courtroom appearance and every carefully timed interview, his name stayed on the one document that carries actual constitutional authority over the British Crown. I keep coming back to that detail because once you genuinely sit with it, the entire story changes shape. The version most people carry is simple enough. Harry and Meghan left, they wanted independence, they moved to California, started businesses, built a life outside the institution. The palace carried on without them. That is the public narrative, and both sides have spent considerable energy maintaining it. But there is another version, and it begins with a question nobody in the palace wants to answer out loud. If Harry truly left, if the separation was genuine and mutual and final, why does his name remain on the most powerful constitutional document the monarchy maintains? That is not an oversight. Removing a councillor of state requires an act of parliament, yes. But the palace could have quietly encouraged that process at any point across 6 years. They chose not to, and that choice preserved across thousands of headlines and one very public lawsuit over security is where this story actually begins. On one side, you have Harry, a man who spent 6 years telling the world he wanted out. The interviews, the memoir, the podcast, the documentary, every public move pointed toward permanent independence, a new country, a new identity, a life that did not require the institution's approval or its money or its rules. But look at what he kept. The title, the Councillor of State designation, the children's titles, secured from Charles in a negotiation that reportedly took months of quiet, back-channel work before any public announcement, the listing on the royal website, the formal constitutional status that any departing family member would have surrendered years ago if departure were the actual intention. A senior aide who worked in the private secretary's office during the early months of the separation once described the situation to a colleague over a late afternoon tea in the equerry's pantry, a narrow room off the ground floor corridor that smells permanently of biscuits and old radiator paint. He set his cup down, looked at the window, and said this. He packed a bag for California, but he left his key on the nightstand, not in the drawer, not handed back, on the nightstand where you leave something you plan to come back for. His colleague did not reply. She already knew. Some truths arrive before the words do. On the other side stands William, a man who has reportedly spent those same 6 years watching this pattern with the clarity the rest of the family has been slower to reach. William does not give interviews about Harry. He does not respond to the memoir. He does not engage with the Netflix material. What he does, according to people who have worked closely with his household, is study precedent. And the precedent he has apparently settled on is one of the most consequential institutional decisions in modern royal history. The Duke of Windsor, a man who abdicated, married the woman he chose, and spent the rest of his life discovering that the family he left had no intention of ever letting him back in. No role, no platform, no path to relevance. A closed door that stayed closed for decades, maintained not through dramatic confrontation but through sustained, patient architectural distance. That is genuinely worth naming plainly because it tells you everything about how William sees this ending, not as a negotiation, not as a reconciliation waiting for the right moment, as a door that needs to close slowly enough that no one hears it shut until it is already locked. The first crack in the public narrative appeared not through Harry or William, but through a man most people outside the palace have never heard of. Clive Alderton, Charles's chief courtier. A career courtier who had served in that role for years, managing the King's private office with the kind of quiet institutional loyalty that does not generate headlines or require public gratitude. Alderton left his position several weeks before the Sussex return became public. The palace offered no detailed explanation. Staff departures at that level are common enough to avoid sustained press attention, and the story moved through the cycle within a single day. But Tom Sykes, writing for The Royalist, connected those two events in a way that deserves serious attention. Sykes is not a tabloid provocateur reaching for clicks. He is a veteran royal correspondent with properly long-standing sourcing inside the institution, and his specific argument is direct. Alderton did not leave because his time was up. He left because he saw what was coming and could not put his name beside it. Here is the part that lands. According to Sykes, the suggestion that Charles only learned about Harry and Meghan's return the Sunday before it was announced is, in his words, frankly absurd. His reporting indicates that Charles was not merely aware of, but actively enabling his son's gradual reintegration into royal life for considerably longer than the public timeline suggests, that the surprise father was a performance and that the institution helped him stage it. I want to take you inside that office for a moment because what happened there matters more than the official version will ever admit. Alderton's office sits on the principal floor at Clarence House, tall windows overlooking the garden, a desk that has been in the same position for 3 successive private secretaries, a filing system that still runs on paper as much as screens. The morning he reportedly made his final decision, his assistant noticed he had closed the door, something he almost never did during working hours. She could hear one phone call through the heavy oak, lasting roughly 11 minutes. When he opened the door again, his face had not changed, but his voice had. He asked her to cancel his afternoon schedule and arrange a meeting with the King's Deputy Private Secretary for the following morning. He did not explain. He did not raise his voice, but within 2 weeks, his departure was confirmed through official channels, and a transition plan that would normally take months had been compressed into days. Sykes' broader argument is that Alderton's exit and the timing of Harry's return are not unrelated coincidences. A chief courtier does not leave a position of that significance without months of planning unless something has made the position itself untenable. And the implication, stated carefully but unmistakably in his reporting, is that Alderton found himself unable to reconcile his duty to the institution with what the King was privately authorising on behalf of his younger son. That asks you to consider something genuinely uncomfortable, that the entire framing of Harry and Meghan as fully independent, separated from royal structures, may never have accurately reflected what was happening behind the institutional curtain. That distance was the performance, proximity was the reality, and the Councillor of State Register, still carrying Harry's name, was the proof hiding in plain constitutional sight. Now consider the theory that some commentators have attached to this pattern because it goes considerably further than institutional enabling. The theory is this: Harry's underlying strategy across 6 years of sustained public criticism directed specifically at William and Catherine was never about independence from the monarchy. It was about destabilizing the institution enough that William and Catherine might eventually choose to step back from the line of succession entirely, which would move Harry closer to the throne. Sit with that for a moment because the specific targeting is worth examining closely. Catherine, not William, has been the sharper, more personal target of criticism, attributed to Sussex-aligned sources over the years. Comparisons around parenting, wardrobe coverage, how she is photographed at public events. If the underlying goal were actually about accountability or institutional reform, the future king himself would be the logical target. But if the goal were destabilization, targeting the future queen consort is a considerably more calculated choice. Her public standing is what shapes whether the broader public still wants William's branch of the family leading the institution decades from now. A former communications advisor who worked with the Kensington Palace press office during the period before the Sussex's departure described a specific moment that stayed with her. She was reviewing media coverage logs one morning in late 2018 and noticed something she had never seen before. 3 separate negative stories about Catherine appeared across 3 different outlets within a 40-minute window. Same angle, same framing, different bylines. She flagged it internally, and the response from a senior colleague was a single sentence delivered without looking up from her desk. "We have noticed, document everything." The advisor closed the log. She did not ask what the documentation was for. She understood the instruction meant the source of those stories had already been identified internally, and the evidence was being preserved rather than confronted. That pattern, if it existed as described, would represent something more organised than organic press coverage. And when you place it alongside the Councillor of State status, the preserved titles and Sykes' reporting about Charles's quiet enabling, a shape begins to emerge that is considerably harder to dismiss as coincidence. There is also the matter of public money, and with this family, there is always the matter of public money. Only 2% of the British public supports taxpayer-funded security for Harry and Meghan. 2%. I want you to sit with that number because it is as close to unanimous opposition as any policy question typically produces in British polling. Most contested issues, even properly divisive ones, show considerably more range, a result that lopsided does not reflect the usual pattern of entrenched camps talking past each other. It reflects something closer to settled national consensus. And yet, if Sykes' reporting holds, the palace may have been quietly working toward a security arrangement that effectively circumvents what the courts already denied. A High Court formally rejected Harry's claim to automatic state-funded protection. If a police escort materialises at Heathrow through some informal channel, that creates a precedent suggesting formal legal rulings can be sidestepped when the person involved has the right family name. That is precisely the kind of quiet institutional workaround that generates lasting structural damage to public trust. William, according to people familiar with his household, watched the security debate with particular attention, not because of the cost, because of what it revealed about his father's willingness to bend institutional norms for one family member at the expense of the institution itself. Reframe that through money for a moment, because both things can be true at once. A family that publicly insists on financial independence while privately expecting the state to cover protection costs that a court has already refused is not exercising independence, it is exercising leverage. And the currency being spent is not pounds, it is Charles's credibility as a constitutional monarch who governs by convention rather than personal preference. Picture apartment 1A at Kensington Palace on a late evening in the weeks before the return became public. The small study off the main drawing room, blue-grey walls, a single desk lamp throwing light across a tablet screen. William reading something alone. An aide waited in the corridor outside, holding a manila folder with 3 pages of typed notes. A briefing he had been asked to prepare on the Duke of Windsor's post-abdication arrangements, specifically the institutional mechanisms that had been used to maintain permanent exclusion without ever staging a public confrontation. When William finally called him in, the conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. William asked one question. How long did it take before the family stopped expecting him to come back? The aide gave his answer. William thanked him. The aide left. No instruction was given. No strategy was announced. But walking back down the corridor, the aide understood that the question was not historical curiosity. It was a decision being made in real time, and the answer would shape how the next decade of this family played out. Andrew Neil captured something recently that cuts through every layer of speculation and lands on solid ground. His response to an earlier Harry clip, one where Harry had delivered a vague, seemingly scripted statement about making the world a better place, was pointed and precise. Why should anyone particularly care what Harry thinks on subjects he has no qualification to speak on? Would a public collection to keep the couple comfortably settled in Montecito be the more efficient solution for everyone involved? That resonated not because it was cruel, but because of who said it. Neil is not a tabloid voice chasing engagement. He is a journalist whose reputation rests on measured, serious analysis across decades of political coverage. When someone with that kind of credibility reaches for sarcasm instead of neutrality, it signals something worth noting about how far institutional patience has worn, even among commentators who do not typically touch celebrity-adjacent royal stories. And that erosion is not happening in one political direction. The 2% security number draws from both sides of the aisle. Conservative voters who view the Sussexes as ungrateful, and progressive voters who view taxpayer-funded royal security as indefensible on principle. When those two groups agree on anything, the political consensus is effectively sealed. If this kind of layered breakdown is useful, the like button genuinely helps this channel keep reaching people who want the fuller picture. Now stay with me, because what happened next is where this gets properly revealing. Here is genuinely where I land after sitting with all of this. The return was never a homecoming. It was the final move in a 6-year campaign to remain constitutionally relevant while publicly performing independence. Harry held every thread that mattered. The title, the Counselor of State designation, the children's titles, the website listing. He attacked the institution with one hand and gripped its constitutional machinery with the other. And Charles, whether out of guilt or love, or a father's inability to close a door on his own child, let him do it. William saw all of it. Every preserved thread, every quiet accommodation, every informal security conversation that should not have happened after the court ruling. And his response was not anger, it was architecture, the Duke of Windsor model. Not a confrontation that generates headlines for a week and then fades. Sustained, deliberate, structural distance. The kind that reduces relevance gradually, year by year, until the question of return becomes irrelevant because there is nothing meaningful left to return to. That is the verdict a growing number of serious commentators now share. Not the tabloid version, not the gossipy version, the institutional version. Harry kept his key on the nightstand for 6 years, and William has been quietly changing the locks. Think about what that looks like practically over the next 5 years. No joint appearances at state occasions. No shared platform at any public event where both brothers might be visible. A slow, methodical reduction of every thread connecting Harry to official royal life. The Councillor of State Register quietly amended through Parliament during a routine governance bill. The website listing removed without announcement, discovered weeks later by a royal watcher taking screenshots. The children's titles maintained on paper but never used in any official palace communication. Not a single dramatic act, 100 small ones, each one deniable, all of them permanent. I want to be fair here because there is a version of this story that requires no grand strategy at all. Several commentators have pointed to reporting that Harry and Meghan experienced genuine social isolation in Montecito in recent years. Oprah Winfrey reportedly no longer in regular contact. Other prominent local residents keeping a comfortable distance, a social circle that contracted rather than expanded as the years passed and the novelty wore off. People who find themselves properly lonely in one place sometimes do something remarkably ordinary. They go home, not as strategy, not as institutional manoeuvring, just homesickness and a quiet desire to be closer to the family they still belong to, despite everything that has been said and published and broadcast. Most of us know someone who left a marriage, a job, a city, swearing the separation was permanent and final, and then 3 years later quietly moved back into the same postcode because loneliness is a more honest motivator than pride will ever admit. That does not mean the return is innocent of calculation. It means calculation and loneliness can share the same suitcase without anyone acknowledging either one is packed. Elton John reportedly pushed back when approached about helping cover Harry's mounting legal costs. Not a dramatic refusal, something closer to a boundary drawn quietly but firmly over a phone call that lasted less time than either man expected. The kind of moment that happens when a long friendship meets a financial expectation one too many times, and the wealthier friend reaches a point where generosity has a limit he had not previously needed to name out loud. That detail matters because it shows the pattern extending beyond the institution and into Harry's private world. The same underlying dynamic. Hold on to the connection, preserve the access, draw on the goodwill, and eventually the person on the other side reaches a point where the cost of maintaining the arrangement exceeds what the relationship can sustain. Nadine Dorries, who lives locally in the Cotswolds and whose social circle reportedly includes Queen Camilla, described receiving more than 30 WhatsApp messages within minutes of the news breaking. Residents worried about security disrupting the school run. A pointed comment questioning whether the couple had ever heard of Daylesford, implying the area already had its own established version of the artisanal lifestyle Meghan's brand promotes. Dorries herself added a direct message. The Cotswolds is not especially dazzled by celebrity. Basic privacy and respect would be offered. Entitlement would not land well. A considerable number of her neighbours would regard the couple's finances as fairly modest by local standards. That complicates the simpler narratives because the Cotswolds is home to quietly wealthy, low-profile residents who are not remotely impressed by fame on its own terms. The couple's reported net worth, while considerable by any normal standard, would place them comfortably in the middle of their new neighbours' range rather than at the top. And in a community where real wealth means the ability to live without anyone knowing your name, arriving with cameras, security concerns, and a global brand identity is not glamour, it is noise. Consider what that local reception actually tells you about the broader dynamic. Harry and Meghan built a public identity around the idea that the institution rejected them, that the family was cold, the press was hostile, and the country was unwelcoming. Moving to a community that openly signals it is unimpressed before they've even arrived suggests the rejection narrative may follow them regardless of geography. Not because people are cruel, but because the kind of integration they would need to find genuine belonging requires exactly the anonymity their public identity has made impossible. I keep coming back to that Councillor of State Register. A document most people will never see, stored in an office most people will never enter, carrying a name that should have been removed years ago if the public story were the real one. Harry's name. Still there? still carrying constitutional weight, still granting the authority to act on behalf of the Crown to a man who has spent 6 years telling the world he wanted nothing to do with it. That is genuinely where I land after sitting with all of this. Not the dramatic succession theory, which requires assumptions about hidden motives no one outside that family can verify. Not the simple homesickness explanation, which ignores too many preserved threads to hold the full weight of the evidence. Something in between. A man who wanted to leave but could not let go. A father who wanted to help but could not say no. And a brother who watched it all unfold and decided quietly, in a small study with blue-grey walls and a single desk lamp, that the only answer was the one his family had already used once before. The door that closed on the Duke of Windsor stayed closed for decades, not because anyone slammed it, because no one ever opened it again, and the Counsellor of State Register, that quiet constitutional document in its secure palace office, will tell you whether the same thing is happening here. When Harry's name finally disappears from that page, the story will be over. Not because of a headline, because of an absence nobody announces. So here is where I leave it with you tonight. Does Sykes' reporting about Charles quietly enabling this return across 6 years change how you read the King's own public statements about being surprised by the announcement? Or does that specific reading require a level of sustained institutional deception that seems impossible to maintain across that many years without leaking considerably earlier? And separately,